Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to welcome you to today's Humanities in Action event. My name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences. And many of you have been to many of our Humanities in Action events before. I'm going to start a little bit differently today. I want to start by telling you what it was like to go to parties in the 1980s. And what I mean by this was that on Friday night or Saturday night, whenever it was, there would be some debate that I would have with a friend of mine. We'd say, well, John Fogerty is back, but the reason he can't perform any of his Creedence Clearwater Revival songs is that the record company won't let him do it. And they say, no, I swear I heard him say, play that song last week. And you say, no, I bet you $10 I'm right. And you'd both shake hands on it. And then nobody would ever collect on the bet, right? Because nowadays, this never happens. Am I right? If anyone has, what won the Oscar in 1987? Boom, you pull it up and there it is. So it's this really interesting thing that we have today, this access to really accurate information. And at the same time, as we'll see in today's talk, we can see how accurate is information. How is it sometimes dangerous to have so much instant access to what you think are answers? And what might the people who are putting the information out on there, what might they want you to see? And what might they be steering you towards? And so it's, I realize that there are so many bets that I know that I won. I know I was right. But, there is that sort of, that age of, I guess you'd say, there was some virtue in the ignorance in the old days. And we're going to see what the implications are about access to so much information. So that's what we're doing here today. And I'm excited to have this, a very important topic that we're talking about. So that you'll be able to stay focused throughout, I'm going to ask you to do one thing for me, and that is silence your cell phones today if you could. And we'll just turn those down a little bit. At the end of our talk today, I'm going to, please stick around a little bit. We have some programs we'd really like to share with you, especially next week. Our new music program is coming up. So we really would like you, we'll tell you a little bit about some of our programs. So please stick around. And of course, if you want to find out more about Carolina Public Humanities and all the incredible work we're doing for our K-12 teachers through carolinak12.org or through our incredible outreach that we're doing throughout the state with community colleges and libraries, or the amazing Zetlow Initiative. The Zetlows are over here, and the leader of the Zetlow Initiative is right over here, Kylie Seltzer, which is a wonderful program. We are just launching on civic engagement. We're really excited that we're going to really begin to see the products of that exciting initiative. So check us out, humanities.unc.edu. Take a look at all that we do, and let's get right to it with our presenter today. Francesca Tripodi is assistant professor in the UNC School of Information and Library Science, the top school for information and library science in the country, and the principal investigator for the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Dr. Tripodi is a product of USC's Annenberg School of Communication. She also pursued a MA in Communication Culture and Technology at Georgetown before finishing an MA and PhD in Sociology from the University of Virginia. She also held an appointment at James Madison University before coming to Carolina in what year? No, it doesn't matter. 2020, yeah, relatively recently, so welcome. Dr. Tripodi is a widely cited expert on misinformation and search biases, with her research appearing in the Washington Post, New York Times, the New Yorker, the Columbia Journalism Review, Wired, The Guardian, and of course many peer-reviewed journals as well. In 2019, she testified in front of the U.S. Senate on the algorithms and query processes that drive extreme content and ideologies onto people's devices. She is the author of 2 books, a co-authored work with Andrea Press entitled Media Ready Feminism and Everyday Sexism, and the book that informs this talk today, The Propagandists Playbook, How Conservative Elites Manipulate Search and Threaten Democracy. Dr. Tripodi is also doing work on sexist editorial practices on Wikipedia in this critical field of what we call information integrity, analyzing how doing your own research in an age of chaotic access to data can strengthen misinformation campaigns and cloud reality. I steer you all to the website, ftripodi.com, which has a great selection of her work, and I urge you to visit it. And without further ado, please welcome Dr. Francesca Tripodi as she discusses The Propagandist Playbook. Take it away.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was so nice of you. I feel like I could can that and have it on my shoulder. That would be really fantastic. So thank you so much for that. Thank you everyone for making time to come out here today. It's really exciting to have so many people engage with my research. So thank you for that as well. A fun fact before I start, my spouse coined a term for what you're talking about figuring out now when you have bets. We call it a Google throwdown. So when we are having a disagreement, we each agree to our respective opinion on what's happening, and then we Google it. So the Google throwdown is a product of our home. But today I'm going to talk about my book, The Propagandists Playbook. Just a little show of hands before we get started. Does anyone in this room know who Nellie Orr is? No?
I want to say they're related.
Are they? No. That'd be amazing. Okay, great. So that's a good way for me to get started. We'll get there eventually. But before we do, just a quick recap. I'm Francesca Tripodi. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Information and Library Science and a principal investigator at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. This is my website. I like to put a bunch of my work up there. I try to publish everything open access, so it's freely available to anyone who's interested. And this is on the site that's, I guess, called X now, is my handle. This is also my handle on other respective social media sites. So before I get started on the big work that I'm talking about today, I think it's important to understand that this isn't me pontificating on some sort of opinion that I have. The book that I wrote was rooted in data and methods. And so I think it's important to just talk a little bit about how that works and how I collected the research that I'm talking to you about today. So my central research question that I was trying to get at is, how do Trump supporters search and find information that they trust? And I was driven by this question because in the aftermath of the 2016 election, there was lots of questions going on about, well, do you trust the media? What is this post-truth environment? And for me, I felt like these questions were removing agency for the voters who had voted for him. And what I was trying to understand is, if you were voting in that election, where do you go to for news and information that you can trust? So I was able to gain access to two large Republican organizations, a women's group and a college group. And I was able to go to their weekly or monthly meetings. I did events with them. We did tabling events, calling events, etc. And then I also attended, separate from this ethnographic observations, 3 Confederate rallies that happened in the city of Charlottesville while I was a resident in the city of Charlottesville. One of them obviously being the now very infamous Unite the Right rally that took place in August. And that's how my book gets started. And then, consequently, as a resident of Charlottesville, I was also asked to be a juror in the, I was also sequestered, I guess, to be a juror. And thankfully, I wasn't selected in that horrible case. But it did also provide a little bit of context for that as well. I also conducted interviews and focus groups with persons whom I met at the sites of my ethnographic inquiry. So I did interviews one-on-one, or I did focus groups with persons about their media habits and their consumption habits. I then conducted what is referred to as virtual ethnography. So I set up a Twitter account and primarily a Facebook account that were exclusive to this study. As part of the informed consent process, persons that I interviewed would either agree or not agree to be connected to me on these sites. And then I was able to understand, well, how does Facebook feed me content based on who they think I am? So if they think that I'm someone that's a member of these groups, what are the kinds of news and information that Facebook's giving me in my newsfeed? And then I summed it up with what a new methodological process I refer to as media immersion. So I'm an ethnographer, I'm a sociologist. I spend a lot of time just sitting inside different groups and watching them interact. And part of this work, I think, is often neglected in sociology is media and media environments. So for media immersion, I took the sources of news and information that my respondents had identified as trustworthy sources of news. And then I replaced my news and information diet with sources that they had identified as trustworthy news. So for 4 months, I took no news and information from the sources that I traditionally rely on, and I took all my news and information from these sources that were identified by my respondents. And I felt like this was really important for 2 reasons. One, I hadn't heard a lot of these sources that they had talked about. I knew what Fox News was, obviously, that was a big site, but Ben Shapiro, Daily Wire, a lot of the podcasts that they were listening to, I was totally unfamiliar. So by listening to it and immersing myself in it, I was able to glean some of the central ideas that they were galvanizing around. And also it was fascinating because in this time I could have conversations with my peers and say like, have you heard about this? And they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And so it was really important for me to understand just how bifurcated this media environment had become. Then I rely on what's referred to as grounded theory. So I take all my notes and I take all my literature and then I go back and forth between the data and I'm like analyzing content as I'm immersed in this setting. So what did I find? I found a lot of things. I'm going to take our time and I'm going to briefly touch on all of these. I can tend to talk fast, especially when I'm excited. So if there are things that you want me to slow down on, I'm happy for you to interject during the talk, or else we can talk more about it after I'm talking. But effectively, what I outlined were 7 tactics that I was understanding in terms of how information flows online. And I'm not going to read them verbatim because I'm going to go through each of them. But step 1 was effectively knowing who your audience is. So what I was trying to understand is when you're creating news and information that's different from mainstream news, how do you get it to stick? Why is it considered relevant? And how is that important to you? And what I found is conservatives, and I was able to understand this through ethnography, have a worldview that I felt like wasn't being currently discussed quite well. And I'm going to use my own respondents' information because I think that's the best way to do it as an ethnographer. So even though I was rooted inside Republican organizations, every single person I talked to identified as conservative, not as Republican. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because here I am in the Republican Federation for Women, right? And nobody's telling me that they're Republican. So I asked them, well, what does conservatism mean? Like, when you say that, what does that mean? And I think this quote distills it best. Being conservative really goes back down to morals and beliefs. It's about faith, family, the Constitution, and national security. And so I took all of my interviews and all of these questions around what constitutes conservatism, and I crafted what I refer to as the 5 F's of conservatism. And so by signaling to these 5 F's, faith, family, firearms, forces, which is both military forces as well as the police force, and a free market, the news and information circles in my study came to rely on as trustworthy news were effectively taking events and filtering it through these 5 F's of conservatism. I actually have a shirt that someone bought me, and they study political merch. And I was on their dissertation committee, and they bought me a shirt that says, "Stay off of my faith, family, firearms, and freedom." And I was like, oh my gosh, there they are. Like, so these are categories. And I also think it's important. This book came out of a small study that I conducted when I was at Data and Society Research Institute. And that has an independent report. And these concepts I talked to my respondents with. So when I talked to them about the 5 F's, these are things that definitely crystallize with them and they agreed with. This part of building a robust net is the second part of making sure your messaging sticks and resonating with your audience is build a network. And this actually is a really fantastic plot graph of what researchers at Harvard refer to as the right-wing media ecosystem. So you can see here, oh, I guess you can't really see with this weird clicker, but this red area over here, Benkler, Ferris, and Roberts describe as an ecosystem that is separate from traditional credited news practices. So whereas those kind of process over here rely on things like experts or traditional fact-checking kinds of methodology. These in this system do not. They built this network, I think it was 3 million tweets that they had analyzed using data analytics. They're on the quantitative side of my research. And what I did, so effectively, this red zone was the media ecosystem I was immersed in during my media immersion process. And by becoming so embedded in this network, I was able to identify 2 central themes or 2 central fears that were elevated continuously. Sorry about that. In pretty much every podcast that I listened to or news story that I started my morning with, there were 2 central themes. The one is that the left is becoming increasingly dangerous, and that because the left is increasingly dangerous, it creates a justification for increased violence or increased policing around what is referred to as the hysterical left or the very dangerous left. The second theme that I saw in my research is that the media is biased. And interestingly, it also allowed them to think of themselves as part of this media, right? And it distilled in their audience this healthy skepticism for anything that you're reading or engaging with. So they were not only saying the media is biased, and we know the media is biased because they're not really reporting on how hysterical and dangerous the left is, but it's also concerning because you need to do more due diligence in doing your own research and finding out about these topics. The third thing that I found, and this was again just exclusively through my ethnographic observations, is that people engage with media in different ways. So one of the big things that we heard in following the 2016 election, or a lot of the knee-jerk reaction to this notion of fake news that we heard about in 2016, was this idea of increased media literacy. Well, the problem is we just don't have media literacy. Did people hear this kind of concept floating around? And what I found in my research is that the persons who I was embedded in, the groups that I was embedded in, were highly literate. These are people with college degrees that are very affluent and had higher education. And they were in fact digging in to their text in a way that was very profound. And I talk about this concept as scriptural inference. So this is a compare and contrast method of focusing on and prioritizing the direct analysis of primary sources. So I first came to this understanding when I was able to accompany a young woman to her Bible study. So as part of the young Republicans group that I was embedded in, one of the women in the group invited me to come with her to Bible study. I said, sure, we Bible study. And it was really fascinating. I grew up Catholic, so we don't study the Bible. It's not a thing that Catholics do. I've never really opened up and read the lines. And that's actually a huge part of the Protestant Reformation, right? A big rejection of Catholicism was this emphasis on the totem and not on the word. And so I went to a Bible study, and it was a room kind of similar to this, right? Folding chairs, coffee, really delicious sausage muffins, and we dug into about 4 lines of biblical text. And then we applied the lessons learned from that text to our own lives and our own interpretation. That was different, something different for me. But then what I found to be surprising was, as we're wrapping up, the person leading this biblical reading pulled out a copy of the new tax reform bill and said, now, I'm being articulate, a tax reform bill, and said, let's apply a close reading to this text and think about how a close reading of this document and an interpretation of this document and understanding how this document might impact local businesses or our local farmer, how can we understand this ourselves? And he told us, don't let the media interpret this document for you. you have a responsibility to read this on your own, to read the text yourselves. And I saw a time in that, that through this literalist interpretation and really textual digging into content, conservatives can come away with a very different understanding of topics that are intimately connected to media literacy, in fact. And a big one that I notice and write about in my research is what is referred to in my book as the wall of separation. So when I say separation of church and state, what comes to y'all's mind?
No official religion for the country.
There's no official religion to the country, right? There should be this like extreme separation between the church and the state. All religions are allowed, etc. But what I found in my research is that those who really embody this conservative worldview that I was embedded in do not think that way about the separation of church and state. And here's a quote from Tom. Talk about fake news. Jackson was talking about keeping the state out of the church. That's what the wall was about. I challenge you, do a research project. Find the law of the separation of church and state in the Constitution. The words are not there. Now, I know we have like a constitutional lawyer, a pretty expert constitutional person in this audience, so maybe she can field these Q&A after me. But what's fascinating about this is I Googled it, like we're sitting there together, and these words come from the letter to the Danbury Baptists that Thomas Jefferson wrote. So by digging into the letter of the Danbury Baptists, they have interpretation around this document that actually very much protects what they believe in and justifies what they believe in. And it is not there just because someone told them so, but has been verified as such. So what does this mean? Well, effectively, what I talk about in my book is that even though this is a practice of interpretation that is intimately connected to the Bible, and I would argue very unique to U.S. Protestantism, the scripture in conservative worldviews within the United States can be transferred to other documents, whether this be the Constitution. This was also really big in my ethnographic work. Little pocket-sized constitutions were often on tabling events, and they went very, very quickly. This was also elevation of the Federalist Papers. Certain ones have been read by conservative audiences as ways of justifying and understanding their place in the world. And we saw this actually in Trump's first impeachment hearing, right? So when people were calling on the audience to read the memo, read the transcript, they were saying read the transcript. It was actually just a memo. There was no transcript of the call, but they were engaging this idea of read the transcript. You see this beautiful, these are persons that had come to a baseball game, right, with the read the transcript. By digging into this transcript and saying very explicitly these very specific words were not present in this transcript, thus it exonerates Trump from any kind of wrongdoing in this call to President Zelensky. It allowed for his supporters to double down on support for him, right, in 2020. I think it's important to note that support for Trump increased from 2016 to 2020. And it was through these kinds of tactics that it made that support not seem blindsided, not seem mob-like, right, but actually highly researched in those beliefs. So the fourth step that I talk about in my book is thinking about how information flows. So I'm in a school of information and library science. We think a lot about information retrieval and why categories matter. And it's important to understand that the way search is functioning has been like moving at an astronomical rate. Like I can't even explain it. Of course, my book cover came out and I was like, oh, this is like evergreen, a search bar, and then ChatGPT is like here and now. I don't even know. But so how does information flow? Well, I like us to think about this in a completely apolitical way. By first thinking about just basic retrieval systems and how it's changed when it comes to Google. I pick on Google a lot because it's like the biggest, but I think it's also important to know it's not just Google, and we can talk about that too in Q&A. So how is information ordered? When Google kind of first started, you would punch a question into it, or I don't know if any of us remember Ask Jeeves before, right, these things came in, and it was effectively like just a whole bunch of hyperlinks. So it would engage us in this very exploratory practice. On those hyperlinks, we would find the information we needed. Search engines, Google primarily, are slowly changing to a more semantic way of organizing information through knowledge graphs, where they're trying to answer our questions for us. Now, that's not a big deal if our question is something static, right? These really static searches that we're always going to have how many meters in a mile, and I'm never going to remember that, right? Because I live in the United States, and that's just how we did it. But I can very quickly search to Google, what is that 5K I'm running in terms I can understand? And that's not necessarily a problem. But when it aligns with what sociologist Arlie Hochschild calls deep stories, that's where our search practices get more complicated, and that's how they can become easily manipulated. Deep stories is something that Arlie Hochschild talks about. These are these stories that have been told and retold so often that we know the story without actually hearing the whole story. These are stories that feel really true, even if they're not, okay? And what I like to think about is how deep stories intersect with ideological dialects. So the way we see the world shapes the kinds of words that we use. A lot of research has shown this, right? Even the 5 Fs, right, show this in terms of the words that we use to signify what we're talking about. And that often these words or these phrases or these ideological dialects are reflective of the deep stories we've heard growing up. So what does this mean when it comes to the internet? I like to start with the least political thing I can think of, which is the sky, and the color of the sky. So what color is the sky? Yeah, I was going to say Carolina blue. Already we've made it political, right? I know it's the color of the sky is like totally non-cultural unless you're here. Okay, so the color of the sky is blue, and we often think, or Carolina blue, right? This is a statement that's often used as shorthand for like, is that true? Well, is the sky blue? Right? These kinds of ways that we're thinking about it. What sociological and cultural textual analysis has shown us is that the sky wasn't always blue. This wasn't part of our lore forever. And if you look at original editions of the Hebrew Bible, or you look at Homer's Iliad, right? They have references to the sky. Yeah, is it purple or red? Which were like, what? And researchers have shown that it's because blue is highly synthetic, right? So blue doesn't exist in nature all that often. And thinking of blue in nature, if you're in a space that doesn't have synthetic blue, this is also why a lot of the Virgin Mary paintings are blue, because it came from a stone that was really hard to manufacture, and so that paint was like extremely valuable, right? So blue wasn't something that was every day until you get this like highly synthetic manufactured process. What does this do with Google? We'll come back. The power of inputs, deep stories, ideological dialects. When I search, the sky is blue, I get some pretty immediate answers. The sky is blue because of the colors travel shorter. I get immediate visuals that the sky is blue. I get a YouTube video, why is the sky blue? But I bring up inputs and the sky to think about how you can change one small little word, like the sky is green, or the sky is red, or the sky is purple, yellow, and Google will return that reality, right? It's programmed, in fact, to return that relevance. So what we think about how algorithms are programmed, how they surface, how it is just so good, is because it's trying to anticipate what we think. And it's those keywords, those inputs that we rely on, are a main driver for the kind of information that ends up returned to us. So, politically, how do ideological shape keywords? Here's just like two very different ways of seeing the world, right? On one side, you have undocumented immigrants, democratic participation, North. Our top return is El Centro Hispanico, raising our voices for immigration reform. So I'm an information seeker whose deep story connects to immigrant rights, who's someone that thinks that they should be voting. Those might be words that I use. If I'm someone that has a different opinion on immigration, perhaps my keywords say something like illegal alien voter fraud, North Carolina. Those are very different returns that show up on my search bar. These now, I would say probably the opposite of El Centro Hispanico, right, is immigration and customs enforcement. So you have on the right, both of these screens. And I want to stress in this, it's not about misinformation, actually. It's about how you start your search and the way you see the world to begin with. Now, while everyday people don't necessarily know that, politicians do. Pundits definitely do. And work, bonus point, anyone know who wrote a book called Words That Work? Yeah. Frank Luntz. Frank Luntz, who is probably one of the most brilliant strategists, I would argue, to date, when it comes to political influence. Frank Luntz is a Republican strategist who effectively took back over the House in the 90s by creating a contract to America, a ton of focus groups with conservative voters and trying to figure out what are the issues they can. Did a drumbeat for people running for Congress and photocopied, here's how we talk to our voters, here's how we unify our language around these things. And he's actually responsible for the concept climate change. Because global warming sounded too scary. We weren't going to create any policy to address global warming. And so they were directed by Frank Luntz to, when someone asks you about global warming, redirect it to climate change, because my focus groups have found that it makes it seem like the science is still out and sounds a lot less scarier. So Frank Luntz, since the 90s, understood words work. And words work really well on the internet. So what I talk about in my book is how politicians and pundits have an incredible ability to activate those deep stories and create sets of words around what they're talking about. I call this process keyword curation signaling. So they create words and phrases around very specific ideas or around narratives that kind of seem true, even if they're not. You push them out there, and then you talk about it across platforms. So this kind of thing is not just happening on the internet, right? You're talking about it on radio shows. You're talking about it on broadcast. You're talking about it, well, I guess radio is broadcast. You're talking about it on television broadcast and radio broadcast. You're talking about it in newspapers and podcasts. And by doing this, you're actually tricking search engine heuristics. So what do I mean by that? It's kind of a weird phrase, but how information is ordered, how it shows up on Google, is based on a lot of different things we don't know for sure. But if a whole bunch of people are searching the same thing at the same time, and there's not very much about it online, guarantees that your content will really elevate to the top. And this works with what researchers refer to as data voids. So when little to nothing exists online, it's very easy to manipulate that content, that return, without any programmatic understanding at all. So coming back to Nellie Orr. Who is Nellie Orr? Nellie Orr, wife of Bruce Orr, who was working at the Department of Justice during Donald Trump's first impeachment hearing. This actually first came up on QAnon. So this is from QAnon conspiracy theory. Isn't it weird that she used to work for Fusion GPS? So Nellie Orr was a contractor for Fusion GPS. Nellie Orr was married to Bruce Orr. Because Nellie Orr worked for Fusion GPS and Fusion GPS hired Christopher Steele, who wrote this dossier that wasn't good, right? We know it wasn't great material. It discredits Fusion GPS, and then discredits Nellie Orr, and by extension, Bruce Orr, and is evidence that the impeachment hearing against Trump is a witch hunt. Okay? So QAnon turns into not QAnon pretty quick. So if you go to YouTube and you type in, who is Nellie Orr? Here are our top returns. Fox News, Fox Business, Fox News, Fox News, Fox Business. Also, none of this content is relevant anymore. Nothing's been posted about her in like 3 years. The search engine slowly caught back up. So if you search for her now, there's been enough coverage in mainstream news kind of helping people along the journey like I just did, right? So there's like a CNN story that kind of says like, well, why is this person a connection? And there's a Washington Post story. But for years, that was the only return. And what's fascinating about this example is during Trump's first impeachment hearing, and I have a op-ed on this in Wired, Representative Devin Nunes used his opening remarks to say, we shouldn't be talking about this today. What we should be thinking about is Nellie Orr and Fusion GPS. Now, I was driving to work at the time, and this was like over a year since I had stopped my media immersion. I swear, I thought I was having a stroke, actually. Like, I was like, what is happening? I hadn't heard that name in so long. I honestly thought I was in like a new space. Like, I pulled over and I was like, am I okay to drive? Is this happening for real? Did this happen for real? And then I went to my office and then went back and then listened to it. And I was like, okay, I didn't imagine hearing that name, because for most people I speak to, that is not a name that resonates, or I don't think anyone would even hear. So the last idea that I talk about in my book is like this make old ideas seem new. So deep stories are ones you tell and retell, but you can't sell stale content, right? So you shiny up an old idea by attaching to it a new personality. Stop the steal, I think, is a really important one. So Stop the Steal is a really powerful, deep story that my research shows us has been around for effectively Reconstruction. And I know this because I've read W.E.B. Du Bois. So for those of you who don't know W.E.B. Du Bois, everyone pick him up. He was writing in the 1930s, 1935, Black Reconstruction in America. He uses the phrase misinformation in 1935 to talk about how business were able to write the history of Reconstruction, to frame it as a moral failing of Black Americans and not capitalism, right? And these were books, he did his content analysis by looking at school books, what was in our schools. So W.E.B. Du Bois shows us that all the way back in the 1800s, When Black men first got the right to vote as a result of the Reconstruction Act, they elected a historic number of Black men to Congress. And shortly thereafter, the lie of stop the steal is born, right? That surely there must have been some sort of corruption, or else how else could these men have won these seats, right? So we see this then again in the 1980s, the National Ballot Task Force. So this was created as part of the Republican National Convention, actually, to stop voter fraud. It's very, very big concern around voter fraud. Police officers that would patrol traditionally Black and brown neighborhoods inside the city of New York. And this key word, National Ballot Security Task Force, was actually also used in 2016. And you can look at some Twitter data on that. So, the thing that I talk about in my book is effectively disinformation, while kind of shiny and new idea, is actually super, super old. It flows on a fairly well-worn path. So how do you close the loop? Well, you get people to do it themselves. So I call this idea of doing your own research. Are we still okay on time?
Oh, you're front.
Okay. I don't have any idea where I'm at, so I figured I should just check. Okay, so how do we make old ideas seem new and close the loop? As I was talking about earlier, this distrust in the media, you really want to activate this idea of doing your own research. So I call this in my book the IKEA effect of misinformation. Comes from business scholars. So business scholars coined this term, the IKEA effect. They have found that when people put together furniture themselves, they value it more than a piece of furniture that has been assembled for them of similar quality. I know. my IKEA furniture is not great. I think they looked at this too, like resale value. I still use Craigslist. But I guess it would be Facebook Marketplace, I think, is the more recent one. But you can kind of see when people post furniture for sale and they like put it together themselves, they like think it's worth a lot, and it's just not, right? I mean, that's the whole point of IKEA, right? But so talk about this tangible do-it-yourself quality to information seeking, right? So by activating this idea of don't trust us, do it yourself, it makes people think that they are engaging in this like active self-discovery when they're actually more on, I drive it like a scavenger hunt, right? Where they've been given a list of terms and ideas, activated to go search for them, only to find out what they've already seen. So a big question I get is, how do we fix it? This is an important question. I joke, you never invite a sociologist to fix something. That's just like not what we do. But I do think important ways we can fix it. One is trying to identify keywords before they run amok. So a new research project I'm starting is thinking about how content created on Wikipedia and safeguards Wikipedia has in place to protect against vandalism might actually give us some really good insights into what these words are as they're being manufactured and as they're being put out. There's also an amazing organization that I just found out about called Moonshot. So Moonshot is connecting search terms to crisis help. So they have found when they have a new thing in beta, if I'm searching for phrases associated with white supremacy. So an example that Safiya Noble talks about in Algorithms of Oppression, for example, like black on white crime. If I am searching for hate-filled content, they are testing this new software where you get a link that says, "Are you lonely?" Because it turns out a lot of people engaging in like hate and who are involved in hate groups are kind of disconnected. And what they found from this, so in their study that she was showing me, like 400, there was something like 400,000 of these searches in the state of New York in just 1 month. But through this, they were able to connect with about half of people that clicked on that prompt and was like, you know what, I am kind of. And out of this, they were able to connect them to crisis centers, right? Who then established that of that small portion, I think it was something like 10%, were either considered to be a danger to themselves or a danger to others. And there were people that came to their home. So intervention, I think, is possible. Hopefully I can be part of that solution. The big thing that I like to talk about, though, and the worry that I have with fixes, is that this problem is not a one-stop shop, right? Content like this is being continuously recycled. We see how it's being recycled. And so a big thing that I talk about in my book is that we can't just look at a retroactive solution and then be like, oh, phew, we solved the internet, right? No fact checking is going to erase white supremacy or white supremacist thought. And a thing that I think about is how disinformation is not a bug in the code, but it's a feature that's being wielded for political gain. And I argue is a great risk to democracy, both in our country as well as abroad. So with that, I left a lot of time for discussion. So thank you.
Have plenty of time for questions. I want to remind folks in the online audience, I'm looking at you in the camera in the online audience, that we have, why don't we start with an online question, and we'll give you folks in here to get your hands up. So our first question from our online audience comes from Paul Connick. Hello, Paul. Putting aside the specific issues and ideological orientation involved, do you have any reason to believe that the tactics and processes you refer to are unique to the political right? If so, why? Also, you appear to refer to mainstream media as the norm. It may be the norm, but that does not mean that it is itself not riddled with ideological biases and errors. So 2 questions. One about, is this on the left? Do you see this as well? And the other one is just about ideological biases in mainstream media.
Sure. That's a great question. It's such a great question that I have a slide for that. Doesn't the left also do this? And I think that it's important to ask that question. So does anyone know who this person is?
Dan Savage.
Dan Savage, right? Okay, so Dan Savage is, can anyone read his t-shirt? It says, Google Santorum.
Oh, yeah.
Do so at your own risk. So Rick Santorum is a very prominent politician, had come out with a lot of discourse around not allowing gay couples to adopt, right? It was around this discussion around gay rights. Dan Savage is a very prominent radio personality and advocate for gay rights. He's a gay man. He and his partner started the It Gets Better campaign, for those of you who might be familiar. Understandably, he did not like this position. And using his radio audience and his power as a radio audience, he said, let's rename Santorum. Audience, what's the most disgusting thing you can think of to name a Santorum? And he bought the website www.santorum.com. And his audience came up with some interesting, not safe for work content about what we should name this as. And he used that and then drove his audience to this website. And that website was the first return during that political campaign, and he lost that campaign. So definitely pundits and personalities, and I would argue that's definitely classifies. So propaganda is about uniting the nation around common concerns or brands in order to move the needle in one political direction or the other, right? It's not a one unidirectional idea. I would argue this is not like propaganda. because it was less about unifying the nation around a common understanding of Santorum and more about his audience and kind of like a FU, right, to someone that had power. But it's very possible, right? We can see how search engines are manipulatable from any stretch of the imagination. That being said, I do think, I'm a sociologist, so it's important, we have to take power into the equation. And we have to acknowledge that just because political actors on the spectrum of politics can manipulate search engines doesn't mean that they're advocating for are somehow equal or synonymous. So yes, the left could do that. Also, I would argue this is a way of creating more balance to search returns, right? So instead of having these like filters around words or phrases, like how could we potentially tag our content in ways that might reach people from other sides of the aisle? In terms of the other idea, like, sure, again, you know, you have this idea of like, there's different agendas behind different media, but that's not really the argument of my book so much as oh, sorry, that's the other thing I was going to show you. The left is really, really bad at it. So in addition to my ethnographic observations, I also was able to partner with a data scientist who wrote a script to look at how content creators tag their own content on YouTube. So we looked at some of the most engaging or viral content creators on the left and on the right. We did the top 10 most progressive, engaging YouTubers in terms of like millions of clicks and subscribers, and then those on the right. And we basically pulled their metadata to see how do they tag and categorize their content. And the content creators on the left like just have no understanding of how the internet works, right? And it's just bizarre. Like it's like, and also there's a really great book by Jen Schrady called The Revolution That Wasn't, that talks about this same possibility in terms of like the internet's supposed to be this great equalizer, but in fact, if you have a lot of money and time and connections, you can use the internet better than people that don't have money and time and connections. But what we found is that content creators on the left were doing a lot of like literal tagging. So they're like, my video is about podiums, and I'm gonna only tag it about podiums. And people on the right were like, ooh, I'm trying to get that podium audience. My talk's about chairs and why they're better than podiums. I'm just gonna also tag it with podiums, right? So that when you're searching these terms, their content is being elevated in a way. And then they also are really good at creating unique words and phrases so that their content's the only content that's being returned. Nellie Orr, I think, is a great example of that. So what I talk about here in my book is keyword appropriation. So I think when you think about power, you have to think about words have power. And so when groups that have been traditionally or historically oppressed within our society create sets of key words to elevate their content and amplify their stories, we've seen that these can then be co-opted by content creators on the right in order to like drown out that sound. So an example I show of this is the Abolish the Police movement that's been, going for quite some time, but I would say gained a lot of traction in 2020. The top return for when you search Abolish the Police, and again, these are my own searches. These can't account for personalization. YouTube's a different beast than Google, even though they're owned by the same company. But if you're looking at like Abolish the Police, the top return is actually making fun of the Abolish the Police movement. It's a content creator that is against that idea, but they've tagged their content with Abolish the Police, and they've titled their video Abolish the Police. And so it is considered relevant if you're searching for Abolish the Police. So that's like, again, understanding how information goes. But then this movement Abolish DEI, which we've seen really gaining traction throughout the United States, is only utilized by the content creators that are really pushing that narrative. And so I would say, yes, it's easy to tag your content, but no, not everybody is doing it.
Let's take a question from the in-house audience.
Okay. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about Yuval Harari's book *Sapiens* and his concept of myths uniting us as various groups and subgroups. And specifically, I was interested in your sort of Google thing, where the output you receive depends upon the input, meaning it's individualized, plus your IKEA thing. Are we creating our own myths? And if that's true, does that help explain sort of the fragmentation that we're seeing in society, the more chaotic situation that we're seeing currently?
Yeah, so I would say I'm not a folklorist, and there's a really amazing work within this like whole subdivision of academia. So I feel kind of like I'll answer this, but also caveat. There's better people that could answer your question, I think. I will point to the work of Whitney Phillips, who is a folklorist that I have been heavily inspired by, that has shown how she calls it information pollution is like coincides with this. But yeah, I mean, as a sociologist, like we know that we are united through the power of narrative. I mean, that's how many cultures still exist and operate when it comes to history and what we remember. And, you know, I would say we've always existed, and there's no like universal narrative. There's always going to be cultural specificities that, based on our lived experiences and our worldviews, like shape our belief systems in very siloed, fractured ways. I don't think I answered your question, but I don't know. Basically, what my research does is say, like, yes, and here's how it works on the internet. Because like when I was like, oh, well, it's important, these keywords, these inputs really matter, I thought, well, surely this is not novel. And 1,000 researchers have said this. And surprisingly, not 1,000 researchers have said, like, your sociological position and where you're starting from is going to influence your returns. So there's a lot of really important work in information retrieval that tests a ton of things that can impact how you're able to retrieve information. Age, technological connections, time, whether or not you know a lot about the subject. But less work has been done on how your worldview kind of influences those returns. So I have a new paper that just came out on seeking information about abortion access. And I did a study of information seekers. I was in the library using a loaner laptop. So I wanted to kind of control for personalization, and we removed cookies before each search. And I would ask people a prompt that said, your friend is unexpectedly pregnant and considering terminating the pregnancy. Do you have an opinion on this? And about 60% supported their friend's decision to terminate the pregnancy. And about 40% said, I don't support that decision. I would not support that decision. And I'd say, great, can you take this laptop and find me some information that you would feel comfortable sharing with your friend that based on what we just talked about. And the people who did not support abortion were searching for things like alternatives for abortion or adoption clinics, North Carolina, or how do I get my friend information for how to adopt? And people who supported abortion were searching abortion near me and Planned Parenthood. Right? Actually, there was a lot more search continuity amongst people who supported abortion than people who didn't. But the other thing that I found in that is that, so that's like, in some ways, we are creating our own realities, But I think it's also very important to remember that search engines are corporate entities that are not libraries, and they're driven by corporate goals. And so another central finding from this project is that regardless of using the phrase abortion, whether you used abortion near me or alternative for abortion, the top return was always an advertisement for a CPC, a crisis pregnancy center, which do not provide abortions and are actually anti-abortion organizations. They're heavily invested in dissuading people from having an abortion. So, in some ways, yes, we're crafting these narratives around what do I believe and how does that shape that narrative, but also there are corporate interests in the interface by which we find information, and there are organizations actively trying to interfere with that information seeking. Did that answer your question? I may have made up my own question and then just answered it. But,
We have a question here.
Yeah, I'm around Google searches. Have you actually been able to talk with anybody at Google or know anybody else who has confirmed some of your theories about how it returns information? And also, I assume that it also is going to, if you've asked similar questions previously, it's going to remember what you've already asked before. It's going to remember which sites you visited before. So it's probably likely to return those same sites to you in the future.
Sure. So yeah, that's a great question. So I would say there's some really amazing people working at Google, and also Google has an organization called Jigsaw that is like kind of Microsoft research, but for Google. So they're doing a lot of research, and many of them have read my book and my what is that called? Report that was free ahead of time, and I would say there is a lot of interest around what I'm talking about. And what I think is good, and I think it's also important to say, like, I pick on Google because they're the biggest, but because they're the biggest, they also have a search integrity team, right? They also have the money to pay for programmers and UX designers to like keep tabs on these kinds of manipulation, whereas something like DuckDuckGo does not have that. So I think DuckDuckGo protects your privacy in a different way, but the exact same things happen on DuckDuckGo. So it's not like, oh, now you don't have to worry about being manipulated. In terms of, do they agree with me? So I would say sometimes they're like happy with things I write and sometimes they're not, but that's all right. I don't work for them, so it's fine. But there is a lot of importance on relevance in terms of keywords. There are other factors that play into this. So two big things, and actually there's a really cool podcast that our Center for Information and Technology in Public Life put out, and I was able to sit down with two heads of search at Google, and we had a candid conversation about like garbage in, garbage out kind of conversation. So regarding personalization. So according to persons at Google, and again, this is who they are, personalization isn't as prominent as we think it is. So they do use things like geolocation, so that if you search pizza and I search pizza and we're both in different countries, you're getting pizza relevant to your geolocation. This is also true with like weather, obviously, and a lot of those things. When you search for many queries, those search returns might differ a little bit between like 1 and 2, but the top 5 are generally the same across people, is what they say. There's also a lot of work going in to look at other factors. So they use a bunch of different signals to try to determine good content. Some of it is related to words. Some of it is related to the click history of other users. So they're paying attention to which link do other users click on? How long are they on that link? Do they go back? then search for something else? Then do they modify that query, right? They're analyzing all those data. They're also looking at the time of publication, and they look at the backlinks of a website. So is this website just sort of existing in its own whatever, or is it connected to other credible sources of information? What I found in my research is that because all these, it's almost like copy and paste. So when I did my initial search on like Nellie Orr, the top 6 returns were all different, but it was like the exact same story, and they were hyperlinking to each other. So there are mechanisms in place to kind of like trick those signals. And there's just so many possibilities for word searches. Like there's just no way to always be on top of it. But I know they're also like exploring, they created like a 3-dot that many people are not familiar with. I'm trying to see if I have a, it's like if you click on something, the 3-dot will tell you information about the source. So there are things in play that they're trying to do, but.
I think one follow-up question. If you're not happy with the search results, what are your recommendations for improving the result? Would you tweak words in the query? What other options?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest thing you're going to get is play around with the words you put into search. You know, I think it's kind of be a fun game, right? Like think about a topic that you care a lot about, and think about how someone in your family that you don't get along with, right? Because they don't agree with you on anything. And then think about like, what would they search, right? It's an interesting, engaging, it's a way to be engaged with like, what are the other kinds of information about this topic that are out there, and how might I gain access to it? Pay attention to the queries you start with, for sure.
It's fun sometimes with a Google search where you can really just make it clear this Google search is incapable of answering my question. And that's so what my example is, my wife and I have the exact same phones. We have the exact same carriers. She's on LTE. I'm on whatever, 5G. Why? I promise you, ask that question, you can never find out.
Why? Question mark?
It'll say,
Why not?
you should, to set your phone for this, but it can't answer this question. This is like the AI search thing is going to be so
Interesting.
much better for this, right?
Oh.
Anyway, I'm just distracted.
One thing also, well, like that's actually like an example of relevance and why it's tricky. I'm constantly searching for the parental guidance ratings of movies because I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, right? Like, so I'm trying to figure out, can they watch this yet? And I'm always like, Beethoven rating. And then it's giving me the like Rotten Tomatoes rating. Like the whole kind of, so now I realize I have to search parental guidance rating for X, right? But this is a thing that library science has thought about forever, right? Like, how does your query really matter? And this is what, Sophia Noble is like, I think kind of the pioneer of a lot of this work. And she's an information and library science scholar. And that's why, like, how you're categorizing and tagging and ordering information is really tied to what you're going to get.
A question here.
Yes, please. 2 elements of the question. I'm intrigued by your immersion period and how you may have personally reacted and or reformed in any sort of way from that.
Sure.
The second question is, with the people with whom you did research, did you find that they, like we in this room, in this dialogue, have been principally engaging with media that is on the internet, or were many of them merely taking it from social other sources? Those two.
Okay, I'll answer the second one first, in that I would say the media diet is pretty diverse and also mirrors a lot of the age differences in terms of how people access information. So the women's group that I was embedded in skewed like 40 plus, and I would say most of them primarily got their news from television sources or radio, and PragerU was like across the board top information source. So that's internet. And then for younger persons, it was more like podcasts and social media. But often what they would see on social media, and this was true, social media was also true for my older respondents, what they would see on social media, they were inclined to fact check. And this is actually where I thought about this idea of the IKEA effect, is that, and it was one of the quotes from one of the women I interviewed was like, well, sometimes when I search for things on Google, the only thing I see is what I already saw on Twitter. And I'm like, well, yeah, because that's how the search engine works. But who knows that? Nobody knows how search engines work. So here's somebody who in good faith is like, I don't know if that seems right. They're seeing these words on Twitter. They're Googling those words. And then the same story is coming back up. And so then it's easy to like reconfirm or double down on that garbage you saw on Twitter. And that's something that, you know, I do not think is exclusive to any ideological position. I think the whole of us need a lesson in like how a search engine works so that we can use it. With regards to the media immersion, I actually have a story. This is in my book. So it was an interesting experience. And I think it's important whenever you go outside of your zone that you have a grounding presence or something in you to ground you back to where you started from. But I would say the most interesting to me was in the lead up during the Mueller investigation. On the news information that I was watching, it was like these breadcrumbs, like somebody is going to be indicted. Someone's going to be indicted. We don't know who. Someone's going to be indicted. And I was like, who's going to be indicted? And I was like, really like, I wonder who it's going to be. And I was in the shower one night and I was like, oh my God, what if it's Hillary Clinton? What if Hillary Clinton is indicted? And I came out of the shower and I was like, to my spouse, I'm like, what do you think it's going to be, Hillary? And he's like, what are you talking about? And I was like, the indictment. Like, what if Hillary gets indicted? I voted for her. What if she gets indicted? And he's like, Paul Manafort's going to get indicted. What are you talking about? And I was like, we don't know. And he's like, I think we all know. Like, it's like, very clearly that's going to happen. There was no like, who's it going to be? But the news that I was watching was like, we don't know. Someone's getting indicted. What about those emails, right? And then it would go to this like different thing about Hillary Clinton's emails. Debbie Wasserman's IT person who had just gotten stopped at the border for undocumented worker status, right? So this is like, so definitely I think it was warping my understanding of the world around me in a very purposeful way. And that's when I realized just how powerful it was. So what I tried to do in my book is, you know, it's a very salacious title, right? The Propagandists Playbook. But I think it's an important one because the communities that I was embedded in, these are smart people that are doing their research and forming beliefs in a very mindful and purposeful way. And that way of sifting through information is being undermined in a very concerning way to me. And I think if someone like me who didn't believe anything that I was watching going ahead, doesn't share the worldview of the people that I was interviewing, was so quickly like, oh, maybe, you know, I think that is important.
Okay, we have a question here.
This goes to the immediate future, actually, having to do with AI, regenerative AI, and misinformation. When a lawyer can go ahead and get a brief that is about a case that doesn't even exist in the law books. So how do you start, one, doing your search with AI, but more knowing the information you're getting back from this thing is correct? Because it's based on coding. It's based on what's done behind the scene that one has no control over.
No, absolutely.
The propaganda is, you know, so my real question is, how do you tell misinformation? What's generated now and what's generated
No, this
in
is
the
such an
future?
important point. Study that some of my colleagues did, it is interesting how people are activating AI. And so I would say you're seeing this like go-between between at least amongst younger information seekers of like ChatGPT and then Google. The hallucination effect, right, that you're talking about is when it either makes up things or more concerning sources. And that's where I think I've had a lot of time playing around with ChatGPT and being like, what about this conspiracy? So there's also a slide for that. So I put in Nellie Orr. So Nellie Orr, it reconfirms this bizarre narrative, right? That like she worked for Fusion GPS and she worked with Christopher Steele, and she worked on the dossier compiled by British intelligence agent Christopher Steele. That is not true. The dossier was later used as evidence, her involvement in the dossier. And I'm like, and it says, however, these claims have not been substantiated. Okay, but I asked them, I'm like, where does it say she worked on that? And they're like, oh, certainly, here's all these sources. But I'm like, those aren't real. And then they're like, oh, I'm sorry. And then they gave me new ones, and those were real, but they were questionable in terms of information integrity. However, I will say when I search things in ChatGPT on quite sophisticated, I would say, in its narrative around like that's widespread voter fraud is just not happening. And here's why, and they talk about that. So I think you're right in that we need to be concerned, but I also think there's this potential. Because I told it quickly and you only heard it once. But if you hear it every day, it's pretty, it's pretty powerful narrative. And you believe that there's this witch hunt going on to begin with too, right? So it's activating these deeper stories on government distrust, that they're trying to get rid of a president who was rightfully elected, right? There's a lot of these other deeper narratives that align with Nellie Orr. But sure, like you do not understand that because it's not part of that. You wouldn't search it either then, right? So, yeah. I know,
Whoa, Nellie.
I'm sorry.
So I have a kind of a broader question. I think we've always been susceptible to misinformation. It has always been with us. I think what's different now is there may be more of it, but there's also much more good information. And on balance, I think there is no question in my mind that the availability of this information, the ease of accessing it, has made a tremendously positive contribution.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's too easy to vilify some of the sources or to discount them without looking at the extremely beneficial benefits that they provide to all of us.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think
All of those
Google-
bets from high school.
all
for
those
example.
bets for high school. Max would be like rich, right, from all these bets. I think also, yes, of course. I mean, I think how Google orders information and what it filters out is a lot of like pornography, right? A lot of like things that we don't want to see. The reason why we like it so much is because it is incredibly good at giving us what we need. Directions, right? I mean, there's so much, of course, that has advanced. I mean, I think when it comes, there's always been misinformation out there. I guess I would argue that, and again, I would say I'm not a technological determinist in the sense that I don't think ChatGPT is bad or good. I actually think it's quite fun. I use it daily. And there are some really good ways to use it. I would say what we need to do is, instead of thinking of it as like fact checking, we need more search literacy of like, how do you use these tools in a way that can empower, so that we don't end up engaging with the not good stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
My background is in advertising. It's not in academia. And I worked for Bill Bernbach, who was kind of a legend in the business. And he had an interesting point of view on how we use information. He said there are always three sides to an issue: your side, my side, and the truth. And the reason that is true is that as humans, we always seek advantage. We come with a perspective and we are looking for a gain. So the way we search, the way we use information is to create something we want.
Yeah.
And that we cannot be objective because we're human.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, you're like in a social class. I mean, absolutely. There's no such thing as objectivity. We're always coming to things with our own biases. Part of what I try to do in my book is show you how you see the world shapes what your returns are going to be. And also, yeah, knowledge is power, in the sense that whoever's in power controls the knowledge. So, of course, there's going to be 2-3 sides to a story. Advertising is also kind of the original SEO Goliath, right? And that a lot of these strategies that are being used for news are like, keyword curation is SEO 101. If you're selling triangle tortilla chips, you don't want to call them Doritos because that's market saturated, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned from other disciplines for sure.
We have an online question from Paul Connick. The problem of disinformation in social media is that of open access resulting in pollution or vandalism of the commons, which raises the thorny question of what, if any, kind of fences need to be erected.
Content moderation question. Okay. I don't. I have an expert for that. I would say you should have Robin Kaplan come in here. She's a Duke's Stanford School for Public Policy. She does a lot of amazing work on content moderation and is much better equipped to answer this question. I would say a couple things about that. One, we know that content moderation and deplatforming works for curbing hate speech and defamatory content, and that that is sometimes necessary. I think it's also important to recognize that we think of a lot of these spaces as like the new public sphere, but they're not public spaces. They are corporate entities with policies and rules and guidelines. I think it is thorny though, right? Like, how do you moderate content is really important. And even though I tended to agree with some of the content moderation decisions that happened following the 2020 storming of the Capitol, or 2021 storming of the Capitol, I would say it's concerning to have a private corporation with that much control. So I have no good answer for that question. I'm sorry.
Answer.
Okay. Lots of other questions.
So I was wondering, I am under the impression that the more clicks something gets, the higher it gets elevated in the search routine. And of course, most people are way more interested in clicking on bad news or something that shows a negative side than a positive side. I mean, they've always said happy newspapers don't sell. So how does that influence the fact that it is easier to get maybe some of these more negative concepts and potentially conspiracy theories, because they're infinitely more interesting than, the truth sometimes.
The fuzzy middle. Yeah. So We don't know for sure how information is ordered because that's their like secret sauce or whatever. It's like the Coca-Cola recipe. We won't know for sure, but we do know it's a combination of the words and phrases you start with, your geolocation, how often that content has been clicked by other people, for sure. Clicking is part of it. And so I would say you're right in that use that to your advantage to get content to trend. And we also know that mis and disinformation campaigns regularly pay troll farms to click content and elevate content. So yes, it is very easy to trick trends, trick trending content, and trick search content. I would say what research, this is like the data void article is talking about. It's particularly easy to do so if no one is talking about it to begin with. So that's why, for example, they have a lot of different examples on here, but news and like newsworthy concepts are particularly precarious, and a lot of journalists are learning about this in terms of how to tag their content in a way that theirs will be elevated at the same time. How do you moderate content? How do you work with like content moderation in regards to that last question when things are happening? Because the example that article draws on.
Do that in the microphone because for whatever reason.
Oh, sorry about that. So with data voids, they talk about how it's easier to trick that with those words and to like create salacious stories around those ideas when they exist in data voids. So I do know that like search engine corporations pay a lot of attention to when bizarre phrases are like all of a sudden getting clicked at a insurmountable rate. I don't think I answered your question either. But yeah, like, yes, truth. Your question is yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Isn't that the phrase?
Further questions for Dr. Tripodi? Let's put our hands together. Thank you so much. Thank you. Excellent. I want to remind folks that we will be sending everyone a link to this talk, and it will have a wonderful link to the book itself. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can get it right here from Flyleaf Books through that link. I also want to just let you folks know about some upcoming programs. We have a wonderful program at North Star in Durham tomorrow night with Sunny Kelly. Go to our website, humanities.unc.edu, for information on that free program. We also would like to, of course, remind you folks that next week, yes, we are doing something here next week, but it's the opening of our music program. So we have Juan Alamo coming. These start later. They're at 6 o'clock, and we'll have, it's about 70% performance and about 30% learning about Juan Alamo's wonderful world of Latin percussion. It's going to bring his marimba down, and you are just going to be in for a treat. So please check out our music programs. We have them every last Wednesday. We're doing music programs. I also want to remind you folks about our weekend seminars. Two upcoming ones. We have Gerhard Weinberg coming and talking about Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt in World War II. And then a fun dinner event on Friday, September 29th, where we'll have two talks on art, music, and the aesthetics of power. And that ends with a wonderful performance on period pieces. We, of course, want to thank our sponsors for all of our programming, Mirka Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley, the North Caroliniana Society. I want to thank Carolina alumni for, of course, sponsoring this program. Let's put our hands together for Flyleaf Books, a wonderful, wonderful bookstore. My colleagues Beth Gardner and Paul Bonici making sure you have seats and everyone can see. And come on up here one more time. Let's put our hands together for Dr. Francesca Tripodi. Wonderful. Fantastic. We'll see you next time.